My name is Andrew Miller, and for the first 8 years of my marriage, I believed I had the perfect life. I met my wife, Jessica, in college. She was studying literature, I was in engineering, and our world felt like one long, sunlit daydream. We bonded over late-night study sessions, shared playlists, and a mutual love of old black and white films. When I proposed on a chilly autumn evening beneath the campus clock tower, she laughed and threw her arms around me, saying, "It's too good to be true." I kissed her then, promising to prove it was real. After graduation, I landed a job at a mid-sized tech firm, and Jessica became an elementary school teacher. We bought a modest house in a tree-lined suburb, furnished it with thrift store finds and IKEA flat packs, and filled it with the promise of what was to come: children, trips abroad, backyard barbecues. Friends often told us how lucky we were, how rare it was to find someone who felt like home. We smiled politely and agreed. Our life together was comfortable, routine, and loving. Weekdays were for work. Weekends were for yard work, movie marathons, and lazy breakfast on the back porch. We celebrated anniversaries with candlelit dinners, vacations to national parks, and nights dancing in our living room to 1980s synth pop. She was my best friend, my confidant, and I trusted her without reservation. Then, about a year ago, something changed. At first, it was subtle, a delayed text response, an evening visit to help at her friend's fundraiser that turned into a late-night drive home alone. When I asked, she shrugged with that easy smile of hers and said, "You know how busy life gets." I nodded and believed her. I figured it was stress from work, or maybe a side project she didn't want to derail. One Saturday morning, I found a lipstick-smudged coffee cup in the sink, one that didn't belong to me. My own mug was chipped around the rim. This cup was pristine white, stained only by a dark red ring. "Who's been here?" I asked when she walked in, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She glanced at the cup, then back at me, and laughed. "Oh, that?" It was my new colleague, Vanessa. She's in marketing. She dropped by to go over the charity auction details. She gave me a quick peck on the cheek and headed upstairs to get ready for brunch. I swept the cup into the dishwasher and tried not to let my imagination run wild. My wife's colleagues frequently dropped by. She loved collaborating outside school hours. I reminded myself of that and let the worry fade. 2 weeks later, I came home from work early. An unplanned project deadline had gotten postponed, and found our bedroom door ajar. I pushed it open and paused in the doorway. Jessica was on the bed, dressed in my old hoodie and leggings, face lit by the glow of her laptop. "Andy," she said, startled. "You're home early." "Yeah," I said, stepping inside. I was finishing the Carson file, and I stopped when I caught sight of the message on her screen. "Last night was incredible. Can't wait for round 2. There was no mistaking the tone, no hint of professional courtesy, only something urgent and excited. I closed the door behind me and cleared my throat. "Jessica, who is this?" Her face paled, the laptop angled away from her. "It's just, please don't worry about it." She leaned forward, shutting the screen. It was a harmless one-time thing. It meant nothing. I sat on the edge of the bed, my heart pounding. "You had a one-night stand?" "I made a mistake," she said, voice trembling. "I'm sorry. A mistake." I repeated, incredulous. "You lied to me. You cheated on me, and now you're calling it a mistake." She opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked like a child caught stealing candy. "It was a moment of weakness," she admitted. "But it's over. I promise you it'll never happen again." I stood up quickly, rushing across the room. "Then why are you laughing?" I asked, nodding toward her face. Even as I spoke, I realized how wrong I sounded, but I couldn't stop. "Why are you smiling?" Her lips twitched into a rueful grin. "I'm not smiling," she said, though the laugh escaped her. "It's just, this is so surreal. Us. Right now. I feel like I'm auditioning for some drama show." I backed away, hurt and anger roiling through me. "This isn't a show, Jess. This is my life." She fell silent then, and I realized I didn't know what to say next. I walked to the window, stared at the oak tree in our front yard, and for the first time really saw it. Branches bare in winter's grip, roots buried deep in the cold earth. I thought of our marriage the same way, roots I'd never questioned, branches I'd assumed would always bear leaves. She came up beside me, her hand hovering in the space between us. "I hate what I did," she said, voice small. "I hate that I hurt you." I turned to face her. "Then tell me who he is." "His name's Mark," she said. He's someone I met at the fundraiser last weekend. He came on to me, and she bit her lip. "It was just one night." "One night stands," I said, voice cold. "That's never just one night." She flinched as if I'd struck her. "I know," she whispered. "I messed up. But I'm here. I'm with you. I love you." I studied her face, the same face that had laughed when I told her I was moving across the country for her career, the same face that had smiled when I proposed, the same face that had stirred something in me I'd never felt before. I saw there was guilt, fear, and maybe even a hint of arrogance, an arrogance that believed words could patch over the deepest wound. I left the room without a word and went to our living room. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. I sat on the sofa and stared at the space between the cushions where she used to lean against me. I opened my phone and found the messages I'd exchanged with her that day, sweet good morning texts, heart emojis, plans for the weekend. I scrolled until I found the text she'd sent me while I was at work. "Can't wait to see you tonight. 2 Arts." That message suddenly felt like a cruel joke. I turned off my phone and sank lower into the cushions, trying to wrap my mind around the woman I thought I knew, and the woman who had broken my trust in a single laugh. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake listening to the clock tick in the hallway, counting the seconds of what used to be our life. I thought back to our wedding day, our honeymoon in the mountains, how she looked up at me with tears of joy in her eyes. I wondered if that girl even existed anymore, or if she'd been replaced by someone I'd never met. By morning, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to let her off the hook with a simple apology. If she would laugh, a hollow, reckless laugh, at the betrayal of our vows, then I would make her regret it. I spent the next few days moving through my routine like a ghost. I went to work, attended meetings, answered emails, but every smile I forced, every handshake I offered, felt like a betrayal of my own pain. At home, Jessica hovered around me, offering to cook dinner, asking if I wanted to talk. I told her I needed space. She nodded, stunned into silence, and backed away. In the solitude of our kitchen, I mapped out my plan. It wasn't about revenge as much as it was about reclamation, reclaiming my dignity, my future, and most of all, the respect she destroyed. I would not sink to petty vengeance, no public shaming on social media or plotting to ruin her reputation. Instead, I'd strike at the foundation of what she valued most, our shared life. First, I focused on our finances. For months, she'd managed the joint account, paying bills, budgeting for vacations, balancing our investments. I let her think I trusted her still, even as I quietly opened a separate account in my name and directed a portion of my salary there. I set up small automatic transfers, nothing she would notice, but enough that, over time, I would accumulate a fund of my own. Next, I turned to our home. We had refinanced the mortgage together last year, locking us into a 20-year plan that paid off only slowly. I approached the bank under the guise of discussing an adjustment for a lower interest rate and, to my surprise, they offered me a new refinancing package under my name alone. I signed the papers without telling her, securing the house in my sole ownership, leaving her portion contingent on my authorization. Meanwhile, I started gathering evidence of her indiscretion. I retrieved the laptop she'd hastily closed the day I discovered her messages. In the search histories, I found the email chains, the photos, and the forwarded messages from Mark. I photocopied bank receipts of late-night taxi rides, scanned the credit card statements for a boutique hotel stay in another city, and saved every shred of proof I could. Not to blackmail her, but so that if she tried to deny it, I would be ready. All the while, I acted as though nothing had changed. I joined her at charity events, nodded along at parent-teacher meetings with her colleagues, and even kissed her goodnight carefully, deliberately, with a tenderness she hadn't deserved. She looked relieved, as if she'd escaped my wrath. But the calm I displayed was only skin-deep, masking the storm I was building. One evening, she asked me to go away for the weekend, a last-minute offer from her friend's beach house. "We need some time to reconnect," she said, eyes hopeful. "Just us. Like old times." I smiled and agreed, packing a bag without hesitation. As we drove, she chattered about the sunsets we'd watch and the long walks on the sand. I listened quietly, pretending to be swept up in her enthusiasm. When we arrived at the house, a salt-bleached cottage overlooking the waves, she threw her arms around me and kissed me deeply, and I felt bile rise in my throat. That night, after dinner, she pressed close on the couch and ran her hand along my arm. "Andy," she whispered, "I love you. I'm so grateful for this." I turned toward her, eyes cold. "So grateful," I repeated. "That's funny, because there are a few things I'm grateful to have discovered, too." Her smile faltered. "What do you mean?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out the printouts, hotel receipts, bank statements, even a screenshot of Mark's flirty text messages. I laid them all out on the coffee table. Her face went from confusion to fear in a heartbeat. "Remember when you laughed at your own betrayal?" I asked softly. "You said it was harmless, that it meant nothing. You thought you could wipe it away with a promise. So here's a harmless little surprise of my own." Tears welled in her eyes as she realized what I'd done. The house was mine alone. The bank knew she had no claim unless I allowed it, and these documents, if taken to court, would leave her with little more than regret. She scrambled to pick up the papers, but I held them out of reach. "It's not too late to fix this," I told her. "You can apologize properly. You can accept responsibility and help me rebuild what you destroyed." She swallowed hard, eyes brimming. "Please," she begged. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I watched her for a long moment. The woman who had stood before me was broken, and part of me felt pity. But the anger I'd repressed for weeks surged to the surface. "Your regret will be bigger than you can imagine," I said. "I'm not just taking half of our life away. I'm taking away the illusion that what I give you can be erased in an instant." She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. I left the house that night without another word, driving back alone under a sky smeared with clouds. As I navigated the winding coastal roads, I felt an unexpected peace settle in my chest. I had reclaimed my power. I had made her regret it. In the weeks after the beach house confrontation, life settled into a new rhythm. Jessica moved into her sister's spare bedroom, and I returned to our home, now legally and solely mine. Friends whispered behind my back, asking why I'd left her, but I simply said, "It's complicated," and changed the subject. At work, I channeled my energy into projects that had stagnated. I found a sense of purpose in proving to myself that I could excel despite, or perhaps because of, the chaos at home. Colleagues complimented my renewed focus and drive, unaware of the battle I'd fought in my personal life. Meanwhile, I monitored the financial adjustments. The joint account I'd quietly drained now held only a token balance. The separate fund I'd built was enough to cover my mortgage for several months without pay. I felt invincible. Every so often, I received texts from Jessica. Pleas for conversation, apologies laced with heartbreak, promises to change. I ignored them. We had a final conversation at the attorney's office, signing the divorce papers, dividing what was left of our shared belongings, and sealing the deal. She was gracious in the sterile, carpeted room, as though she wanted to preserve some shred of dignity. I offered her a handshake and a curt, "Good luck," and that was that. Life without her was a slow adjustment. The house felt quieter, apparently bigger without her presence. I made my own coffee in the mornings, ate cereal on the couch while watching the news, and sometimes paused in doorways, expecting her to walk in with that easy smile of hers. But she never did. Still, I noticed improvements I hadn't anticipated. I reclaimed my weekends, hiking local trails, catching a baseball game with friends, tackling home improvement projects I'd put off. I even rekindled my guitar skills, something I'd abandoned when married life took over. At night, I'd sit on the back porch, strumming chords and watching the stars blink awake. One afternoon, I ran into Vanessa, the marketing colleague who dropped by with the lipstick-stained cup. She greeted me with a warm hug and said, "I'm so sorry about what happened. I wish you'd called me for clarification." I realized then that Jessica had woven narratives that fooled even her friends. I nodded and thanked Vanessa for her kindness. It was the first time anyone had offered me straightforward empathy since the betrayal. A month later, I got an unexpected email from Mark, the man who'd shared that one night with Jessica. He introduced himself, admitted he'd been a fool, and said he wanted to apologize. He sent a brief confession, how Jessica had spun a story about desperation, how he'd felt guilty afterward, and how he'd kept silent at her request. He closed with, "I hope you find peace." I stared at the screen, the cursor blinking. I thought of the smug text message she'd sent me before it all came crashing down. I thought of the beach house and that stack of printouts that had changed everything. I typed back a curt, "Thank you. I wish you the same," and deleted the message. That evening, I opened a bottle of wine, poured a glass, and toasted my own reflection in the window. The man looking back was bruised but unbroken. I raised my glass higher, to the empty chair across from me, and whispered, "To regrets repaid." It's been 18 months since I signed those final divorce papers, and every day since has felt like learning to breathe again. The first few mornings after she moved out, I woke up expecting to see her shadow beside me, her hair splayed across the pillow, the warmth of her shoulder pressed against mine. But the bed was empty, and the silence was deafening. In those early days, I lived on autopilot. Went to work, came home, slept, repeat. I wore my pain like a second skin, as if that constant ache defined who I was now. Over time, though, I realized that grief was not a permanent state. It was a process. Each sunrise offered a choice, to drown in what I'd lost or to forge something new from the ashes. I sought therapy shortly after the divorce, more out of desperation than hope. My counselor, Dr. Patel, asked me to map my emotions on a daily chart: anger in red, shame in blue, relief in green. At first, the pages looked like a battlefield, vast swaths of crimson rage flooded with navy shame. But gradually, I introduced more green. I learned that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting her betrayal or excusing her lies. It meant freeing myself from the role of victim. I practiced self-forgiveness, too, admitting that my blind trust and my own arrogance had helped pave this destructive path. Admitting those truths was agony, but with each confession, I felt a little lighter, as if layers of guilt were peeling away. Rebuilding my social life was harder than I expected. Friends had drifted away during the divorce, some unable to navigate the divided loyalties, others too uncomfortable with my pain. Then Vanessa reached out, inviting me to a small dinner with mutual acquaintances. She apologized for not recognizing Jessica's story sooner and emphasized how much she admired my grace under fire. Sitting around that table, I felt a flicker of the camaraderie I'd once taken for granted. Aaron, Mark's former friend, also returned to my life, quietly, humbly. He told me how Jessica had manipulated him, too, and how sorry he was for not speaking up. In their company, I rediscovered that trust could be rebuilt, one cautious step at a time. At work, I surprised myself by finding renewed ambition. My boss promoted me to lead a small team, and I poured my heart into mentoring each member. I shared lessons about communication, transparency, and the dangers of unchecked assumptions, lessons distilled from my own failure to ask hard questions in my marriage. Seeing my team grow and succeed reminded me that leadership wasn't about control, but about empathy and accountability. I still miss the commute I once dreaded, but now it feels like a bridge to possibility rather than a corridor to routine. I've even started volunteering as a guest speaker at industry meetups, sharing my story, not of woe, but of recovery and resilience. Art became another unexpected refuge. I signed up for a weekend painting workshop, partly out of curiosity and partly because I'd always admired Jessica's talent from afar. The act of blending colors and layering textures soothed a part of me that spreadsheets never could. I began hosting monthly art and healing sessions in my studio, drop-in evenings where people grappling with betrayal, loss, or mental health challenges came to paint and talk. One participant, a young woman whose fiancé had ghosted her, told me my openness gave her hope. When she wept while mixing paints, I realized that vulnerability, once my greatest fear, was now a tool for connection. Last summer, I took a solo trip to the Rockies, no phone service, no obligations, just pine-scented air and winding trails. Each morning I hiked before dawn, sketchbook in hand, capturing the way sunlight pierced through the forest canopy. I wrote in a journal beside alpine lakes, listing 4 things I was grateful for I mourned, and 4 I could choose to let go. By the end of the trip, my gratitude list had grown longer than my morning list, a surprising triumph. I returned home with a sense of calm I hadn't felt in years, as if the mountains had whispered their ancient resilience into my bones. A few weeks ago, I received an anonymous postcard in the mail, a black and white photograph of a deserted beach at dawn. No message, no signature. My first impulse was to suspect Jessica, another one of her manipulative games. But as I held the card, I felt neither rage nor suspicion. Instead, I felt curiosity laced with compassion. Perhaps it was her way of saying she, too, was seeking peace. I placed the postcard on the shelf by my easel, beside a small potted succulent. It reminds me that closure doesn't always arrive in grand proclamations. Sometimes it's a silent offering of shared solitude. Tonight, I invited Vanessa and Aaron over for pizza and beer. We sat on my back porch under a string of lights, watching the neighborhood children play tag in the yard I once shared with Jessica. We talked about careers, travel plans, and the latest Netflix true crime documentaries. At one point, I raised my glass and said, "To second chances, in friendship, in work, and in life." They clinked bottles with me, and in their faces I saw warmth, solidarity, and the promise that human connections can weather even the harshest storms. As I write this part of my story, I I realize that the man staring back at me in the mirror is neither the arrogant husband who ignored warning signs nor the wounded victim consumed by vengeance. He's someone scarred but strengthened by adversity, someone who learned that love, once broken, can still mend in new forms. The house feels like a home again, infused with laughter and light instead of silence and suspicion. My heart feels open, cautious but ready, like a door slightly ajar to whatever the future may bring. And if, someday, Jessica steps back into my life, I will greet her not with bitterness, but with the profound understanding that some chapters close not with a bang, but with a quiet, grateful sigh.